Welcome to the Kentucky Watershed Academy. This presentation is part of Module 6 that's focusing on effective communications. This presentation will cover the science of science communication. In this module, we're going to be focusing in on outreach associated with watershed planning. So we wanted to begin by setting the stage with a nationally representative survey conducted in 2019 by American Public Media that looked at opinions on water. They found that about 50% of people could answer questions correctly about water. Almost everybody cares and thinks that water has a meaningful role in their life, and they are concerned about the future. The public does desire water protection, and 22% have taken action by contributing time or money to a water organization. 7 in 10 conserve water, and 16% are doing something to try to keep water clean. We want to look a little bit more in depth at these opinions. The survey looked at what do people know about water, and they found that about 50% of people know where stormwater goes. About 50% understand the role of wetlands in filtering and flooding. About 47% know where tap water comes from, and only 23% correctly identified non-point source runoff as the largest pollution source. 38% of people incorrectly believe that factories are responsible for the pollution. The survey also looked at how people are connecting with water. Half of respondents felt a personal connection to a specific water body. Oftentimes people are recreating in or around a water body, at least in the warmer months. Many people, more than half, feel that it is important for children to learn about water resources, and 65% are at least somewhat interested in learning more. So people are interested in water and they are connecting with it. Almost 85% are concerned about the future of water resources like lakes and rivers and streams. And the study authors found that despite not having high levels of knowledge about water, people are very concerned about the future of water resources. And this includes marginalized communities especially. It cuts across demographics, but marginalized communities are acutely aware of the issues facing water resources. So we may focus on people not having all the knowledge that they need, but people are concerned and they do want to do something to improve water. The problem is that the actions do not match the scale of the problems. 7 in 10 are taking some actions to protect water in their daily life, and that's mostly through reducing their use. But they don't really know what they do. And the authors found that the water community needs to work together to give them tangible, coordinated ideas for action that will drive change. You can see here in this chart a list of the different actions that adults are taking to conserve water. In January of 2020, the Pew Research Center asked Americans what they consider the top priorities for the President and Congress. You can see here through this chart that the environment was one of the top issues at that time. Further digging into that data, we can see that although the environment is one of the top issues, there's a heavy skew between political parties as far as how much of a priority it should be. We summarize some of these national polls to say that overwhelmingly people do care about water resources. They may not have a lot of knowledge, but they are concerned and they're willing to act if they know what to do to see public policy change on water and environmental issues. And while concern over water does not seem to show a difference by political affiliation, environmental concerns do show a strong difference by political party. Having set the stage on some of the national opinions on water, we want to look more so into how to communicate the data and affect change in behavior. Now, there are numerous different theories that are proposed by sociologists and psychologists and economists and communicators on how to affect behavior change. Everyone has a theory on this change that you are operating under, whether you recognize it or not. But we're going to look at several conceptual models to better understand and evaluate how are we approaching this issue and how should we approach this issue in order to better communicate the science and change. The first model that we want to look at is called the information deficit model, or the public irrationality thesis. And the information deficit model assumes that if people knew what I knew, then they would do what I do. So the model goes like this. People learn something, their attitudes change, and then they change the behavior. Uh, the solution, therefore, is we need more education and awareness. I think this tends to be the default model for most people without maybe thinking more so about how they approach behavior change. They just say, educate, make people aware of the issue, and then they'll do the right thing. However, researchers have put this theory to the test. This is research from Dan Kahan, The Science of Science Communication, and I would highly recommend that journal article. You can see on the left is the public irrationality thesis, or the PIT prediction. In this case, looking at climate change. It would say if you have on the bottom axis, you see science comprehension increase. If the science comprehension increases, then the perceived climate change risk should increase. In reality, they found in their studies that as science comprehension increased, that the perceived risk actually decreased. So the public irrationality thesis was not supported by their research on that issue. Kahan and others proposed the cultural cognition thesis in response to this discrepancy. What they said is, just like when different groups are watching the same sports game, and both will look at a penalty call, and one team will think it was definitely for their side, and the other team will think it's definitely for their side, because they're not assessing the facts impartially. They're using motivated reasoning. In other words, they're wanting to conform their assessments with their own group identity. They want their team to win, and so they see things in that light. So when positions on facts become associated with social groups and identity, then people will selectively assess evidence and patterns that relate back to that identity. So what your group is affects how you assess risk. Kahan found that group identity affects who you see as an expert on a given issue. A lot of this type of research is done on global warming or climate change as an issue. And so they evaluated people's political spectrum, and they asked them the issue to evaluate whether this person is an expert based on their academic qualifications, and then a excerpted statement that either had a high risk or a low risk statement. And based on those statements, whether those statements confirmed their preconceived notions on these issues, determined oftentimes how they are viewed as an expert or not. But they didn't just limit their research to global warming. They found that with some issues, like artificial food coloring or radio waves from cell phones or genetically modified food, there was no association between perceptions of risk and political affiliation. However, on issues like global warming, private gun ownership, or fracking, the relationship between the science and people's political affiliation were strongly related to how they perceived risk. This graph takes these same issues and looks at them in terms of ordinary science intelligence by Democrat or Republican. And so what you can actually see here is that for artificial food colorings or user exposure or genetically modified food, these non-political issues, there tends to be, as people have more ordinary science intelligence, the perceived risk is going down in these cases. However, on these political issues, the higher higher science intelligence that they have, the more of a divide between Democrat and Republican there is. In other words, people are looking to expertise, but they're looking to different expertise on the issue, and it's involving their own cultural identity on these issues. So their identities have been entangled with the science, and so there's no clear consensus on how to address these issues. So in their thesis, they found, and the data showed, that people's identities are getting entangled with their factual beliefs. And so, how do we address this issue? Well, the solution is to disentangle the knowledge and the information from identity when you're seeking to communicate. In other words, you want to try to be as apolitical as possible when communicating the science, or not hit on these types of political identity related issues. I'd now like to transition from the cultural cognition thesis to moral foundations theory. This was created by a group of social and cultural psychologists in order to understand why morality varies so much across cultures and yet still shows so many similarities and recurrent themes. In brief, this theory proposes that there are several innate and universally available psychological systems that are the foundation of intuitive ethics. Each culture then constructs virtues, narratives, and institutions on top of these foundations, thereby creating unique moralities that we see around the world and conflicts between nations as well. The five foundations were initially proposed, and a sixth, liberty, oppression, was added. Here you can see these foundations. You have care or harm, which is cherishing and protecting others, and fairness, proportionality, which is rendering justice according to shared rules, the opposite of cheating, as you will. And these are grouped together in what are known as individualizing values. In other words, they highlight the values of the individual. The next three are what is known as binding values, or they look more at a collective or as a group. So you have loyalty to the group, standing with your group, your family, nation. This would be the opposite of betrayal. You have authority or respect, that is obeying tradition or legitimate authority. So you're not subverting the issues that are there, but respecting them. Sanctity or purity, that's having an abhorrence for disgusting things, maybe related to food or actions. The opposite of that purity or sanctity would be a degradation. And then finally, and it's kind of in a category all its own, is liberty, oppression. This was initially lumped in with the fairness, proportionality, but they found this is a distinct characteristic where there's a loathing of tyranny and a desire for a freedom in that. If you're interested in how you would stack out based on moral foundations theory, you can go to yourmorals.com and you can participate in the survey. But this figure shows from 132,000 different subjects, this is data summarized in 2011, that there's a grouping across political spectrums uh, based on individualizing values versus binding values. You can see that uh, those that would be characterized, self-described as very liberal or liberal, have very high prioritization of care and fairness values, with a lower prioritization of loyalty, authority, and sanctity. So a lower prioritization of the binding values. Whereas conservatives would have a much higher value of those binding values that's about equivalent with the individualizing values. Uh, liber the liberty oppression is not shown on this graphic because it kind of has its own axis, and it's also often very strongly associated with folks that take a libertarian type position. Well, you say, Steve, what in the world does this have to do with watershed outreach? Well, there's been a number of studies that looked at moral foundation and have related them to how people are relating with environmental values and messaging. One of these was done by Lowosco in 2017. And what they did is they took a survey that looked at the people's political orientation. They framed a public surface message related to the environment, either emphasizing individual values, binding and liberty values, or they used just a generic PSA as the control. Then they gave surveys based on values, connectedness to nature, conservation intentions, and then climate change attitudes. And they did this experiments once, and then they repeated that experiment using a common in-group. And we'll talk about more what that message looks like. So here is the PSA that they use when emphasizing individual values. They used a picture of someone caring for a plant, surrounded by children, and planting something in the ground. And see the emphasis there. Share your love of all humanity and the world in which we live by helping to care for a vulnerable natural environment, helping to reduce the harm done to the environment by taking action. By caring for the natural world, you're helping to ensure that everyone around the world gets to enjoy fair access to sustainable environment. Do the right thing by preventing suffering of all life forms and making sure that no one is denied their right to a healthy planet. Show your compassion. So you can see a heavy emphasis on care, harm, and unfairness or equity. Here's another message that was associated with the environment, but using binding values in their messaging. Show you love your country by joining the fight to protect the purity of America's natural environment. Don't trust protection of the environment to the government. We don't need bureaucrats to tell us how to care for our own land. Honor the American tradition of taking personal responsibility for yourself and for the land you call home. By taking a tougher stance on the protecting of natural environment, you'll be honoring all of God's creation. Demonstrate your respect for following example of religious and political leaders who defend America's natural environment. Show your patriotism. So in this case, they show a picture with a flag with mountains in the background or the bald eagle that are there. And you can see a heavy emphasis on the purity, discuss, the in-group loyalty there, as well as the tradition and respect for authority, um, that's there as well. So how do these various messages resonate with the audiences based on political groupings? Well, you can see that the individualizing message was very similar to the control. That is, this is viewed as typical environmental messaging that focuses on care and harm and fairness. And therefore, you see this was well received by the liberal audience, but received much less so by the conservative audience. On the other hand, the binding message was about even between liberal and conservative audiences, but it was so higher for conservatives, lower for the liberal audiences. So, understanding this difference, they went back and did another set of experiments using an expanded common in-group. This is what it looked like. They said, it is no secret that politically liberal agendas have tended to dominate discussions about the environment. However, large numbers of both liberal and conservative politicians, scientists, executives, and religious leaders have argued that traditionally conservative values are extremely well suited to protecting the environment. And then they provide a list of those that were also emphasized in the binding group message. So what they did here is it says, you've been looking at it in terms of your group, but we're showing that your group is actually larger and there's agreement between political sides. So they're untangling identity from the science of the issue here. So how is this message received? Well, by showing it an expanded in-group, the message did not offend liberals. They received the message with almost as high as a rate as when just care and harm and fairness were emphasized. However, this greatly bolstered the conservative response to the messaging, raising it up almost to as high as the liberal response to it. So it recognizes their concerns with the issues, and this message effectively disentangled the target group values without alienating others. So hopefully that shows the way that our moral foundations can be used and applied in messaging associated with environmental issues. Now we want to look a little bit at the theory of planned behavior and understand what it is telling us as far as our how we message. So the theory of planned behavior is influenced by three different elements. It looks at people's attitudes. It says that the behavior will be beneficial to the individual. Then they'll take action. It also looks at people's subjective norms. That is, the belief that other people think the behavior is acceptable. And finally, it looks at their perceived ability, the belief that they have the skills and the capability to change the behavior. So the theory of planned behavior can be used to change behaviors that are already heavily influenced by peers and a close social network. So this theory tells us that the close social network needs to be targeted to support the desired behavior change in the individual, as well, because that's important to highlight the short term benefits of the behavior change in order to promote action. The cognitive theory was developed in 1986 and it grows out of the social learning theory from the 1960s. Anyway, these theories state that learning occurs in a social context with a dynamic and reciprocal interaction between the person, the environment, and the behavior. So, the unique feature of the social cognitive theory is the emphasis on the social influence and on the external and internal social reinforcement. So, social cognitive theory considers the unique way in which individuals acquire and maintain behavior, while also considering the social environment in which individuals perform the behavior. So, the theory takes into account a person's past experiences, which factor into whether behavioral action will occur. The past experiences influences the reinforcement, the expectation, and expectancy, all of which shape whether a person will engage in the specific behavior and the reasons why a person engages in that behavior. Reciprocal determinism refers to the dynamic and reciprocal interaction of a person, uh, the environment, and behavior to achieve goals. In the application of the social learning theory, the learner or the audience is encouraged to observe and imitate the behaviors of others, to see positive behaviors modeled and practiced, and increase his or her own capability and confidence in implementing the new skills. And then they're to gain positive attitudes about implementing those skills, experience support for their environment to use those skills. That's a brief overview of the social cognitive theory. Another theory of behavior change is called the trans-theoretical model or the stages of change model. It was developed in the 1970s to address how people quit smoking. It focuses on the decision making of the individual and assumes that people do not change behaviors quickly and decisively, but continuously through a process. The theory posits that individuals move through six stages of change, from pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, and then maintenance. For each stage of change, different intervention strategies are most effective at moving a person to the next stage of change and subsequently through the model to maintenance. That's the ideal stage of behavior. It begins with pre-contemplation. So in this stage, people do not intend to take action in the foreseeable future, as in like the next 6 months. In contemplation, people are intending to start the healthy behavior in the foreseeable future. So within 6 months, they're going to start. They're thinking about it. Preparation is people are ready to take action within the next 30 days. They're determined to move forward. They start to take small steps towards the behavior change, and they believe changing their behavior will lead to a healthier life. In the action stage, people have recently changed their behavior, and they intend to keep moving forward with that behavior change. People may exhibit this by modifying their problem behavior and acquiring new healthy behaviors. And finally, there's maintenance. In this stage, people have sustained their behavior change for a while, and they intend to keep it going forward. to move people up these stages of change, the messaging will vary. So, if someone is pre-contemplating, you want to make them aware. If they're contemplating, you want to persuade them. If they're already preparing to make change, you need to educate them. If they're taking action, you want to do things that facilitate it, make it easier on them. And then finally, if they are taking action and they seek to maintain it, you want to reinforce that through reminders. This can help you to decide what type of message do you need to provide to your audience. So we've been talking about theories of behavior change, and we've showed to some degree that the information deficit model does not hold up when looking at empirical results. And so we want to summarize some specific risks that come if you're just doing an awareness campaign, because if you're doing things incorrectly, it can have an impact that's negative to your audience. These points are raised by an article by Cristiano and Neiman in 2017, but I've given some Kentucky specific examples. So one is that you may spend a lot of money on messaging, but there's no action. An example of this is riparian zones and horse farms. Uh, Come to find out that we've done a lot of messaging according to riparian zones, but a drawback from some horse farm owners is a disease that can be spread by that interact with the horse's food source. And so uh, their concern is about providing these pathways for these animals that can harm their horses, whereas we're looking at different things. And so there's a disconnect between it. And until we can address those concerns, the horse farm owners are likely not going to take action. Second, you actually may be having messaging that's reaching the wrong audience. An example of this would be in Detroit, where they were seeking to increase tree planting in minority neighborhoods, but the residents there rejected that because they had a distrust of the city and some actions that the city had taken before. So because the city did not work with that community to understand their reluctance and their needs, it led to further distrust and again, a not accepting the trees in that area. You can also create harm. So flushable wipes were marketed as an alternative. We don't want to actually flush wipes down the toilet. So these flushable wipes were invented, but they've actually increased the clogging of the sanitary sewer systems because they don't break down in the systems. So they're marketed as flushable, but they're not. So it can create harm. And lastly, you can have a backlash. I found out about this at experience presenting the USGS Sparrow model to some Kentucky agricultural groups who had done a lot of work and investigation of this model, and to them that was not acceptable. So even though I was using this as just an introduction of some concepts and some general predictions of nutrient issues, there was a backlash from that, and I realized this was a landmine type word to refer to. So sometimes, if you're not aware of your audience and how they are interacting with the data, you can cause a backlash and a rejection of your messaging. So we want to move from just raising awareness to affecting behavior change, and that means that we need to change our values in our outreach efforts. We need to do a better job of listening, and we tend to lump things into what we agree with or we disagree with, but engagement needs to have two-way communication so that we can shape and have a greater conversation with the audience. That requires skillful listening and participation in that community to better understand its needs. Secondly, we need to increase trust, right? Trust is based on perceived competence and warmth. You can see this in the way that people view nurses or doctors. Who do you think people trust more? Well, they tend to trust nurses more because nurses are viewed as both competent and warm. Okay, so in presenting that data, people want to know your point of view. They want to know your humanity. They want to know where you're coming from. They want to know that you're competent, and they want to know that you're a real person. And finally, they want to have a positive identity. People are more likely to accept messages that reinforce or build their social identity and belonging. they will tend to react against things that will make them feel as like less as a person. Uh, so these are some of the values of outreach, and we hope that all of this will convince you that you really do need an outreach strategy. And we want to try to provide you with tools through these presentations that follow in order to help you to build it. Thank you for your time.